The signal here is simple. Gaming is getting more expensive at the same time player trust is getting weaker. That's the real issue. Hardware prices are moving up. Game prices are testing a higher ceiling. Subscriptions keep changing their value. Live service games can disappear. Digital ownerships keeps getting thinner. So the player is being asked to pay more money in a system that feels less stable than it used to. On the surface, this was like a pricing story. Games cost more. Consoles cost more. Subscriptions cost more. But that is the basic read. It's not the full read. The deeper issue is trust. Because price increases hit differently when people feel secure. If I pay more and I know what I'm getting, that is one conversation. But if I pay more and the deal keeps changing, that is a different conversation. That is where the industry is right now. Players are not just paying higher prices. They are paying higher prices inside a market where ownership, access, and long-term value feel more conditional. That is the signal. Gaming is still huge. It still makes money. But the way it is making money is putting more pressure on the players. And when pressure goes up while trust goes down, you get a market that can still look profitable on paper while feeling worse to live inside. That is the part people miss. The easy read is this. Games are expensive because everything is expensive. And to be fair, that take makes sense. Development costs are higher. Hardware components cost more. Inflation hit almost every consumer category. Companies have employees, supply chains, investors, servers, licensing deals, and massive production pipelines. So no, I will not sit here and act like games should stay the same price forever. That would be basic. But that is still the surface version. Because the issue is not just that prices are rising. The issue is that the value promise is changing underneath the price. That is where this gets ugly. Take hardware. Console hardware gets cheaper as the generation goes on. That was one of the old console rules. You wait a few years, the price drops, bundles get better, and the barrier to entry gets lower. But this generation has been weird. Sometimes players are paying more for the same console years later. Sony raised US PS5 prices in August 2025, with the PS5 listed at $549, the PS5 Digital Edition at $500, and the PS5 Pro at $749. Then in March 2026, Sony announced another global increase, with US prices effective April 2nd, 2026. The PS5 at $649, the PS5 Digital Edition at $600, and the PS5 Pro at $900. That's not a small thing. That changes the feel of the generation, because now the players is not just asking what console should I buy. They're asking what is the same door into gaming? Why is the same door to gaming getting more expensive this late into the cycle? Nintendo is part of this too. Nintendo announced the Switch 2 MSRP in the US will rise from $449 to $500 starting September 1st, 2026, citing market conditions. Reuters also connected some of these price pressure to memory chip costs, spikes tied to AI data center demand, with Nintendo and Sony both flagging memory costs as pressure on their games business. That matters because the player is now getting squeezed by forces they did not sign up for. AI data centers want memory chips. Hardware costs go up. Console makers adjust pricing. And regular players end up paying more. That's the system. Most people are not sitting around tracking memory prices. They just see the checkout screen. And the checkout screen keeps getting heavier. Then you get the $80 game conversation. Nintendo confirmed Mario Kart World at $79, while Donkey Kong Bonanza sits at $69 for Switch 2 launch pricing. That tells you something. Nintendo is not just raising the hardware conversation, it is testing the software ceiling too. Microsoft tested the $80 line with the Outer Worlds 2, then reversed course and brought the game back to $70 after backlash. That's not random. That is a test balloon. The $80 game is not fully normalized yet, but the industry is clearly testing the player's pain tolerance. And that phrase matters, pain tolerance. Because companies are not just pricing based on what something costs to make. They're also measuring what players will absorb before they push back. That is a service read turning into a system read. Because once you start looking at hardware, software, subscriptions, and ownership together, you stop seeing isolated price hikes. You start seeing a market testing how much weight the player can carry. The real issue is that the system is shifting more risk onto the players. That is the system underneath. The player pays more upfront. The player pays more monthly. The player buys less certainty. The player invests time into games that might not survive. The player buys digital goods that often function more like licenses than true ownerships. And companies still want the emotional loyalty that old school ownership created. That is a contradiction. You cannot treat players like temporary renters and still demand long-term trust, like they own the place. That is where the system starts to crack. Look at subscriptions. Subscriptions were sold as the cheaper path into gaming. Pay one monthly price, access a large library, try more games, take fewer risks. That was the promise. But now subscriptions are starting to look like another pressure point. Xbox Game Pass is probably the cleanest example. Reuters reported that Microsoft raised Game Pass Ultimate by 50% in October 2025, from $19.99 to $29.99 per month. That is a major jump. Then in April, Xbox officially dropped Game Pass Ultimate from $30 to $29.99, and PS Game Pass from $16.49 to $13.99. On paper, that sounds like relief. But then Xbox said future Call of Duty titles will no longer join Game Pass Ultimate or PC Game Pass at launch. So the price came down, but the content promise changed. That is a trust problem. Players are not just asking, what does this cost? They are asking, what does this even mean now? Because the price changes. The tiers change. The day one promise change. The content changes. The players have to keep recalculating whether the deal is still a deal. That's just exhausting. I know some people will say, no, just cancel it. That sounds clean, but it misses the point. The issue is not whether one person can cancel one subscription. The issue is that the whole model trains players to rent access within a constantly shifting agreement. And when that agreement changes enough time, people stop feeling like customers and start feeling like test subjects. Sony is not outside this either. PlayStation Plus also saw short-term pricing pressure in 2026, with 1 month PlayStation Plus Essential going to $10.99 and a 3-month plan going to $27.99 in select regions. Again, one price change by itself is not the whole story, but the whole story is the pattern. Hardware up, game testing higher ceilings, subscriptions shifting, digital ownership weakening, live service games shutting down. Each piece alone can be explained. Together, they create a trust problem. And the biggest trust pillar is ownership. Reuters reported on June 2026 that the European Commission said it cannot legally require withdrawn games to remain playable, but it will work on a voluntary code for game end of life. The report centered on Ubisoft shutting down The Crew, making it permanently unplayable for people who bought it. Ubisoft argued players bought limited access, not full ownership. French consumer group UFCQ Corsair argued Ubisoft misled consumers about how long the game would remain available. That is the whole argument in one story. Purchase price, ownership language, server shutdowns, legal limits, player trust, all sitting in the same room. And that's why California's AB 2426 matters too. The law requires digital storefronts to cleanly disclose when consumers are buying a license rather than unrestricted ownership of a digital good. The Verge framed it as digital stores being forced to admit customers are licensing content, not truly buying it. That is not just legal housekeeping, that is a cultural shift. For years, digital storefronts trained people to click and buy. Buy the game, the movie, buy the digital item. But now, the industry is being forced to say the quiet part in a clearer language. You may not own this the way you think you own this. That is the system underneath. Players are being asked to spend more money in a market where ownership keeps getting thinner. That's the trust problem. It's not just expensive. It's expensive and conditional. And conditional value is harder to trust. Now let's get to the human cost. And the cost lands on the players. Regular players. People with jobs, bills, limited time. People who buy 2 or 3 games a year and want those purchases to count. They pay through higher entry costs. They pay through higher software prices, subscription recalculation, lost access, burnout, and they pay through hesitation. and that hesitation is crucial, because when players get burned enough, they do not always quit gaming. They move differently. They wait for sales. They skip launches. They avoid live service games. They stop buying cosmetics. They cancel subscriptions faster. They refuse to invest early. They become harder to convince. That's not entitlement, that is learned behavior. If a player spends money and time inside a game, then the game shuts down. They remember that. If a subscription promises one type of value, then shifts the value later, they remember that. If a digital purchase turns out to be a limited license dressed up as ownership, they remember that. I felt this personally with games that ask you to make them a habit. You log in, grind, build your account, learn systems, get comfortable, then one day the game starts losing support, or the player base drops, or the servers get a shutdown date. And the whole thing starts to feel like you were decorating a rented apartment with no lease. That is a live service problem. Live service games do not only ask for money. They ask for habit. They ask for attention, friends, identity. They ask you to make space for them in your life. Then when those games disappear, the player does not only lose access. They lose the time and energy they poured into a world that no longer exists. That's why shutdowns hit harder than people admit. XDefiant is a clean example. Fast Company reported Ubisoft pulled the plug on XDefiant just 6 months after release, with servers set to close on June 3rd. The game reached over 15 million players, but engagement faded, and the shutdown came with as many as 277 layoffs. The story has two human costs. Players lose the game they invested in. Workers lose jobs because the live service bet failed. That's the brutal part. The player gets told to invest early. The workers get told to build the machine. The company chases the live service upside. Then if the numbers do not hold, the machine gets shut off. And everybody below the executive layer pays the price. That is why every failed live service game teaches players to wait. And the more players wait, the harder it becomes for the next live service game to survive. That is a trust death spiral. Players are not dumb. They can see the pattern. They can see when the game is asking for their time before it has proven it deserves that time. They can see when a company wants forever game commitment without forever game stability. And the data backs up the attention problem. GDC's 2025 State of the Game industry survey said 33% of AAA developers surveyed were working on live service titles, but developers also raised concerns about declining player interest, creative stagnation, predatory practices, microtransactions, burnout, and oversaturation. That tells you that people building these games can see the pressure too. Newzoo's PC and console analysis also support this. Player growth has plateaued. Live service games become a zero-sum fight for attention. Players are overwhelmed by content. People are spending more time on fewer titles. And only 12% of 2024 total playtime came from new games. That is a giant signal. The industry keeps building like players have infinite time, but the data says players are narrowing their attention. That means every new live service game is not just competing for money, it is competing for mental bandwidth. And mental bandwidth is limited. Attention is not unlimited. Patience is not unlimited. Trust is not unlimited. When people feel like every game wants to become their second job, they eventually protect their time. That is not player negativity. That is survival. Now here is the chosen move for this. Do not judge gaming value by hype. Judge it by durability. Do not judge a game only by trailers. Judge it by what happens after launch. Do not judge a subscription only by the current price. Judge by how stable the promise is. Do not judge digital purchases only by the word buy. Judge by what you actually control. That's a smarter move, because the old way of looking at games does not fully work anymore. The old way said, is this game fun? That still matters, but it is not enough. Now you also have to ask, do I own this, or am I licensing access? Does this game require service to function? What happens if the player base collapses? Is this subscription giving me lasting value or temporary noise? Is this game asking for money, my time, or both? Am I buying entertainment or am I buying an obligation? The last one is crucial, because a lot of modern games does not just sell you fun, it sells you a machine and a schedule. Daily quests, weekly resets, battle passes, timed events, limited cosmetics, seasonal grinds, login bonuses, and then it calls that engagement. No, at a certain point that is not engagement. That is pressure with a progress bar, and players have to get sharper about this. I'm not saying stop buying games. That would be a weak takeaway. I'm not saying every subscription is bad. That would also be too broad. I'm not saying every live service game is predatory. Some are effective. Some do respect their time. Some give players real value for years. The point is that players need a better filter. And the filter should be this. Is this game respect my money, my time, my ownership, my intelligence, and my trust? That is a player respect test. Because price alone does not tell the full story. A $70 game can be worth it if it gives you a complete, durable, high-quality experience. A $20 game can be a bad deal if it pulls you into endless spending. A subscription can be great if the same terms are stable and the library matches your habits. A subscription can become a bad deal if the price shifts, the content promise weakens, and you stay subscribed out of inertia. That's where players have to be careful. The mistake will be judging every move by outrage. Outrage burns hot and dies fast. The smarter move is to judge the structure. Look at incentives, access, ownership. Look at the long-term deal. Because if players keep looking at this the old way, they will miss the real consequence. The real consequence is not just paying more. The real consequence is paying more while owning less, trusting less, and getting less certainty in return. That is the part that matters. The bottom line is this. Gaming is getting more expensive while trust is getting weaker. That's the real story. The surface story is price. The deeper story is control. Who controls access? Ownership. Who controls the value after you pay? Who carries the risk when the model changes? Right now, too much of that risk is landing on the player, and players are starting to respond. They're not abandoning gaming. They're becoming more selective. That's the move. Pay attention to price. Do not stop there. Watch the promise behind the price, because a game can be expensive and still fair. A subscription can be cheaper and still be unstable. A digital purchase can look like ownership and still act like a rental. That is why the player respect test matters. Do not ask only can I afford this. Ask does it respect what I'm giving up? Money, time, attention, trust. Because once trust breaks, the discount does not fix it. And once players start treating the industry like it might pull the rug from them later, every new game has to fight through the damage left behind by the last one.
Oh, hey, glad you're still here. I've, just finished syncing the next set of files for you. They're right over there on the screen. Take a look and, catch ya in the next one.